Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, a very special crossover edition with Alex Wolfe from Locked On Knicks. Could the Knicks actually muster a trade offer for Karl-Anthony Towns? Would the Wolves listen? What might that look like? Who could be off the table on the Knicks side? And where we landed on the possibility of a Wolves-Knicks cat trade. It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. Happy Thursday, everybody, and a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV, and follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves, and also at Beecken, which is 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. We're going to get right to it today. This is a special crossover edition of Locked On Wolves with Alex Wolfe from Locked On Knicks. This was initiated by Alex because everybody wants to talk Karl-Anthony Towns, and especially given the Howard Beck conversation on Wednesday's show. If you missed it, Howard Beck came on this show on Locked On Wolves and said that he would be, quote, shocked if Karl-Anthony Towns was still on the Wolves after the trade deadline next February, and he thinks the trade is inevitable. Not what I've been saying on the show. I still think it's unlikely he's traded before the season, but I'm certainly more open to the idea of a trade at the deadline next year, given some of the other information we've gotten here lately. So with that in mind, Alex and Locked On Knicks, they wanted to talk cat. And so we talked through it, and I tried to keep an open mind to it. I don't know that we landed at a place where a trade is feasible anytime soon. We'll talk about the players I would ask for from the Knicks who are apparently off the table, or I guess one player specifically who Alex believes is off the table on the Knicks side. And we'll talk about, like, could we get there salary wise? If I don't want RJ Barrett, could I get this done? Right. So we talked through it. I think it was a fair conversation on both sides related to trade value, and it was a good conversation. So without further ado, let's get to the interview, or the conversation, I guess, that Alex and I had.
All right, it's a Locked On crossover, Locked On Knicks and Locked On Timberwolves. Alex Wolfe here from Locked On Knicks. Ben Beecken to my right or left, depending on your perspective, on YouTube right now, from Locked On Timberwolves. And we're here to talk mostly about Karl-Anthony Towns, but in general, just sort of about our two teams and where they find themselves in this offseason. Ben, we may as well not beat around the bush because there's a lot to talk about. What's going on with Cat right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously Cat, it feels like, has been in trade rumors for the majority of his time in Minnesota. And it's funny now. It's actually a really touchy subject. It always has been, but especially now, because Karl-Anthony Towns has publicly said he wants to be in Minnesota. He said it before last season. He obviously signed the Supermax last summer, kicks in next year. And he said it even recently. And obviously the Wolves, like, he's under contract for the next 5 years or whatever. It's really more that the team was disappointing last year. The Wolves went 42-40, and everybody expected them to sniff 50 wins and potentially be a top 4 seed in the West after the Rudy Gobert trade. But because they only won 42 games, they actually won 5 less games than they did before the Gobert trade, and they have another center in Rudy Gobert. That, this narrative of could the Wolves trade Cat has kind of taken off, and there is validity to it this time. I've said for years on Locked On Wolves, hey, the Wolves aren't trading Cat. There's no reason, and I'm not, I don't mean to throw all national media and big market media, under the bus coming from a mid-market Midwest team, but there tends to be a narrative of hey, these other teams can trade us their stars. It feels that way, at least sometimes. And it really never felt real until now, and it's strictly salary cap related. I mean, the Wolves are about to give an extension to Anthony Edwards, an extension to Jaden McDaniels, and they already have a Max and Rudy, and obviously a Max and Cat. And so it's going to get real expensive real quick, especially with the new CBA. So that's where it all stems from. And it's entirely possible that Karl-Anthony Towns is traded.
Yeah, how scary do you think that? I mean, you alluded to the supermax. I mean, do you think that there's a chance that something like this might come together with the Knicks or another team almost exclusively because of this new CBA and how punitive it's going to be for teams that spend too much? And I mean, Cat by the end of his deal, by 2027 to 28, which what's head
It's
math
like
on that? He's not
it's
super
yeah.
young anymore. He'll be
Oh,
like
he's 28. Yeah. So
so
that
he'll
I
be
mean
like
he's
33 by then,
mhm,
roughly. I mean, might make $60 million. I mean, that's a
yeah.
ton of money. And I understand that, they just said today that when the new TV deal comes in 2025, the salary cap might take another huge leap again, and they might cross whatever they said, like $5 billion annually in revenue or something like that, or something along those
Yeah.
lines. I think was what the number that Woj tweeted out. But I mean, it seems like right now, star prices are sort of, I wouldn't even say normalizing. Like it almost seems like it's turning into a buyer's market now because some of these teams are now being like, oh crap, like a $50 million contract is a
Yeah.
lot more punitive than it was, especially if this guy is not like one of the top 5 to 10-ish best players in the entire NBA.
Mhm. Yeah, and at this point, it really feels like, Cat's kind of squarely in the middle of what most would consider his prime years. The ship has probably sailed for him being a top 5 player in the league. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, I had Howard Beck on Locked On Wolves on Wednesday. We were talking about at the end of the show, just kind of like just a few years ago, it was like Jokic, Embiid, and Towns. Like, who would you rather have? You could throw Porzingis in there. Like, who's gonna be the real like unicorn, right? That was the term a few years ago, and it ended up being Jokic and Embiid left the other guys in their dust, and Towns up until this last year, it was never had any major injuries. He missed a few weeks here and there. But yeah, I mean, he's 28 now, and that idea of a top 5 to 7 player like Anthony Edwards, there's definitely hope for that to happen. And so the idea for the Wolves then, of course, and Tim Connolly, the Timberwolves president of basketball operations, said as much in his exit interview at the end of the season. He was basically like, hey, we're building, and not basically, he did say, we're building this team around Anthony Edwards. And then, of course, he threw in the, and Cad and Jaden and everybody. But everyone knows that like Ant is still going to be cheaper. He hasn't gotten his extension yet. So he's cheaper than Towns. He's younger than Towns, and his ceiling at this point is higher. And because in part because of the new CBA, a team in a market like, well, really nobody's going to want to pay the repeater tax under the new CBA, but like a team in the Twin Cities can't afford to do that. And so I think that's what's driving this whole thing. And frankly, I still think it's unlikely Towns is traded before the season. But I'm starting to come around to the idea he may be traded at the deadline. And by the way, Howard Beck was pretty adamant that he thought Towns would be traded, if it's not now, by the February deadline.
Yeah, it just seems like if the Wolves get an opportunity to trade it, because the luxury tax, for those that are not familiar, is tallied at the end of the season. So it's not actually where you start, it's where you finish with
Mm-hmm.
salary. So if the Wolves go through the first half of the season and say, all right, fine, let's give this Cat and Gobert thing another swing and just see how it goes. Of course, if they hit like the trade deadline and they're a top 4 seed or something and they're sort of realizing their potential, they'll probably be like, well, no.
Yeah.
you
And I
know?
don't think they're going to hit that cap number this year, but
Yeah.
next year, then when the Supermax does kick in, that's a real, like, he's going to make 36 million this year, but in 24-25, that jumps to at least 52 million is kind of where the estimate is right now.
Mhm.
And then at the end of the 24-25 season, that's when you're up against that number. And like, in theory, you could wait and trade him. Cause like the other argument against trading him now is in part because it was one of the worst years of his career. He was injured a lot. He didn't shoot the ball great. You're selling low a little bit, but then his contract goes up $60 million the following year.
Mhm.
So is it actually any easier to trade him? And that's kind of the game, almost like the Timberwolves almost playing a game of chicken with themselves, like trying to figure out like what's the right timing on this.
Yeah, because it's gonna, as you said, they might not hit that. They wouldn't hit that luxury tax number this year, but the Knicks are going through on a much smaller scale at least I assume internally through a dilemma right now about what to do as far as like paying Emmanuel quickly, like how they want to do that. Like Ant is going to be a no-brainer. Like they'd
Mm-hmm.
better give him his full rookie max like
Yeah.
immediately because he is that dude. Like, and that's the guy they're trying to build around. So that's going to kick in by this time next year. We'll be talking about, hey, for the 2024 to 25 season, his first year of his rookie max is going to be kicking in. That's going to be a lot of money committed to Towns, Gobert, and Ant
Yeah.
alone, you're
Yeah.
probably looking at $130 or so million just
Yeah.
between those three players.
Yeah.
So
And well, that doesn't even include Jaden McDaniels, which actually,
yeah.
if I could ask you, Alex, about
Mhm.
quickly, and maybe we get back to quickly later when we talk about potential trades. Um, what's the thought on what is he? In my mind, he's probably something similar to Jaden McDaniels, where you're not giving him the rookie max, but he wants something close to that, and he's probably looking for. I would imagine something similar to what Jaden McDaniels is going to get. I believe they're the same draft. Yeah, the same draft as Ant too. So,
Mhm.
what's the kind of the current thought on what they might be able to get done with quickly?
It's like $1 million question, right? Or maybe a
Yeah,
$20 million question. Who knows? I think, and Gavin and I talk about this a lot. I'm kind of the mind of, if they can get away with like $20 million, like 4 for 80 or something like that, I think you take that running away with quickly at this point. I think he's well worth that. I know that, like, especially a lot of people in our fan base are very like scared of that $20 million number. And you say 20 million, they're like, oh my God, that is
yeah,
so much money. It's like, no, that's not what it used to be. It's not Amari Stoudemire 4 for 100 anymore, or 5 for 100 anymore. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like, things are different now. Like that's what a good NBA player gets, with some upside. And so, if I was a betting man, I think if they manage to lock something in prior to this season, it would be in the 16 to 20 million annually range. Um, but maybe higher. I don't know. It's so weird, because for the first couple years of his career, it seemed like the Knicks were like not as invested as they should be in quickly, and Tibbs wasn't. And then this year, Tibbs was all in on quickly, and
Yeah.
the team seemed all in on quickly, and he almost probably should have won six man of the year, in my opinion. Like, made this huge leap, had these amazing individual performances and everything. I mean, I think that he's shown that he can be worth every bit of a $20 million contract if he keeps going on the curve that he's going on right now. Um, but it's just a matter of, like, he had a bad playoffs. So did that hurt his value some? Are he and his agent going to want to say, hey, we want to bet on Quick this year. Like, let's see how he does and let him hit restricted free agency. We're not going to take this contract offer now. Get back to us next year, or next summer, and we'll talk. And then maybe we'll get like 25 million annually or something like that. So I'm not totally sure, but I think they would probably prefer to lock him up, and I hope that it would be somewhere in the 16-20 million range, and that would be definitely my comfort zone as far as he's
Gotcha.
concerned.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a really similar spot as McDaniels. I think McDaniels he didn't make it all defensive team, but he easily could have. And I think that would have certainly ratcheted the number up a little bit. But I think it's a similar place, and McDaniels maybe a little more. But that's part of the problem, right? Is like, and they just gave Naz Reid $14 million a year. So yeah, so they got to make tough decisions. And that's kind of where we are with Cat.
Yeah. And you know what's not really a tough decision, though, thankfully, Ben, before we get into some more talking about this, I think it's next. I think this is a good segue. We can start talking about, like, hey, like, would this even make sense for the two teams? What do the teams have to offer? What would the Knicks be comfortable offering for a guy like Cat? I'm also kind of still curious a little bit on your thoughts on his fit with Gobert, because he'd have to either fit with Julius Randle most likely, or potentially Mitchell Robinson on the Knicks in some way, shape, or form, which would be a whole other thing. But first, I think we should let everybody know about some easier decisions to potentially make, and that includes heading to our good buddies at Prize Picks. And Prize Picks is my favorite new daily fantasy game. I don't know if you guys have ever played daily fantasy in years past. I know I used to play, like, the early 2010s. Some of the companies that I won't name, because we're not talking about them right now. We're talking about Prize Picks. But those other games they used to play, it would be like this convoluted system where you have to, like, build a roster using, like, a salary cap, and fun in theory until you realize that you are playing against, like, a ton of what in the industry is called whales, that were just placing tons and tons of bets, or tons and tons of entries all over the place, and using these, like, formulas and everything to make, like, the perfect, most cost efficient entry. And then you realize that you basically flush $20 down the toilet. That does not happen with Prize Picks. It's just you versus the projections available that Prize Picks sets. And it's real simple. You can play with multi sports even. So, like, if you don't want to do all one sport. Let's say right now you don't want to do all baseball. You can maybe do like a WNBA in baseball entry on any given night, or all kinds of sports all around the world, and just say like, I think as a Mets fan, I don't know how confident I am in this, but I think Francisco Lindor is going to get over 1.5 hits today. Boom. It's that easy. That's leg one of your Prize Picks entry. And you can pick up to 6 things and win up to 25 times your money. They also cover like all the sports you can imagine. I won't even bother listing them because we're deep in this ad already, but like any sport you could think of, including like disc golf and cricket and whatever else, you can place an entry on Prize Picks. It's pretty cool if you're a multi-sport fan. So, and the best part is you can make an entry in 60 seconds or less and then have something to root for on any given night as you watch whatever sports on TV, now that there's no basketball at the moment. At least no men's basketball, I should say. So download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. All right, and we're back in talking about the Knicks and the T-Wolves and Karl-Anthony Towns, mostly as the guy that is most likely to move. It's been a while since I told this story, and I'll probably tell it to you for the first time, Ben. I've always sort of followed Cat, and it pains me that I'm not the biggest fan of his game at this point in his career, because I got to cover him in high school one time. That was pretty fun. That was like one of my favorite things in my early 20s. Yeah, I got to when I was like somewhat fresh out of college, I got to cover a oh my God, why is it St. Anthony's game? He was St. Anthony's, right? I always mix them up. Yeah, he was St. Anthony's Metuchen. Yes. I got to cover one of his games. It was against a team that was in my area, that was from the Mercer County area, and they basically went there to get like completely washed by Cat's team in the first round of the state playoffs. And so I got to just sit there and basically watch Cat and Wade Baldwin, another future NBA player, and Marcus Towns, who was on the Loyola Chicago Cinderella team. Those three were teammates at one point, and they just absolutely destroyed the team that I'd covered all year. And then I had to go get a bunch of sad quotes after the game. It was great. But anyway, to get back on topic. So if we start getting into deals here, I'm kind of curious what your thought is. What do you think Cat's value is at this point? I mean, I'll tell you what my concerns are before you say what you think his value is. The injuries worry me. I mean, I know you said that this year is the only real like significant injury year, and yet he's played 35 games, 50 games, 74 games, and 29 games his last 4 years. Now, whether those are just nicks and bruises or not, like that's a lot of time missed regardless. The other concern is, well, okay, this is like a twofold. This sort of goes together like hand in hand. The defense worries me. And, I don't think he can anchor a defense as a center. And yet I think we saw, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think we sort of saw this year, like I when they made that trade, I was like, there's no way that is going to work, because I can't see Cat staying in front of anybody at the 4. Like he can't stay in front of people at the 5 a lot of the time, And so the defense worries me in that regard. And then specifically as it pertains to defense, he's already played for Tibbs once. And maybe you could shed some light on this, but my indication of that whole thing at this point, the whole how things went down in Minnesota, was it seemed like initially like it was like, oh, all of the younger T-Wolves hated Tibbs, like it was like, oh, Levine hated him, Wiggins hated him, Cat hated him, blah, blah, blah. But the more time has gone on, the more mics have been shoved in the face of these guys that used to be on that team. It kind of seems to be like everybody always alludes to like, no, I didn't have any problem with Tibbs. It was someone else. And it's very clearly Cat. So that kind of worries me too, from the perspective of the Knicks. But like I said, I'm kind of curious what you think his value is at this point.
Yeah, in terms of his value, that's really tough to say, and in part because of the superbacks that he's already signed. And I like Wolves fans, if you go and look through Wolves Twitter or Wolves blogs, like before the draft, the idea of a Wolves trade with the Blazers for the number 3 pick to draft Scoot Henderson and maybe get Anthony Simons back, or there would have had to be other pieces involved, obviously, but that was often rumored, and it's actually come up again recently, even after the draft, as a possibility to try and team up Cat and Dame. There was a report, I think it was Jake Fisher right before the draft, basically saying Portland didn't think Cat was worth that, and the Wolves didn't want to do it either. So like, why was it ever a rumor? I don't know. But like, that was kind of a weird kind of wake up call. Like, Portland didn't think Cat's worth the third pick to team with Damian Lillard. Like, that's really interesting. And there's kind of been this theme, and I'll go back to something else that Howard Beck said. He basically said that the Wolves can't overplay their hand. They need to trade him sooner rather than later because they don't want to end up in a John Collins situation. Now, my counter to that is that Towns is better than John Collins ever has been, but I take his point. And then also, like, he said that there isn't a huge market for Cat. I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, like, hey, there aren't that many teams that are willing to give up real assets, and the contract becomes prohibitive because of the salary matching, which is one of the reasons why it's easier to trade him now than it will be, in next summer. So, looking at the Knicks roster, it's actually really, it's not that easy. If, like, say I don't want RJ Barrett, if I'm the Timberwolves, it's hard to come up with a trade without finding a third team that actually works because of how much money Cat makes. So I think that's going to be the toughest thing, is like, what is his true value? And is there a team out there that still says, like, hey, we think he can be the number 2 on a championship team? I think that's kind of the best case for Cat. He's not likely to, you said he's not going to anchor a defense. I don't know that he could be the 1A on a really good playoff team. Like, the Wolves have made the playoffs 3 times in Cat's career. Once was with Jimmy Butler. The other 2 times were the last 2 seasons, when I guess you'd say he is still the best player on the team, but so much of that is you also have Anthony Edwards, and you also have in this year you had Rudy Gobert, and there's other factors in there too. So all that to say, I guess back to your concerns about his defense, I would say that Cat has improved incrementally on defense almost every year of his career, certainly over the last 3 or 4 seasons. And when the Wolves had Tibbs at head coach, they ran Tibbs, defensive scheme, and Cat didn't really at that point, I don't think he really knew what he was doing defensively. And it reflected in my mind partly on the coaching staff for not figuring out how to make the defense better. Tibbs' calling card was supposedly defense, and the Wolves didn't have a great defense under Tibbs. They were actually much better on offense. But now this has kind of gotten lost, but last year, so not 22-23, but 21-22, before Gobert came, the Timberwolves actually had the 13th ranked defense in the league with Karl-Anthony Towns as the center. And it's because they switched completely what they were doing. They played under Ryan Saunders. They played exclusively drop, pick, and roll coverage. And so Cat was essentially backpedaling towards the rim, and he never quite figured out how to do that in the right way. Last year under Chris Finch, 2 years ago under Chris Finch, they played this really aggressive blitzing scheme on defense, which is actually more similar to what Tibbs runs than the other schemes that Towns had played in. But it was really effective because they had Patrick Beverley and Jared Vanderbilt and these athletes, these long, guys that just played 100 miles an hour. And Towns was effective in that scheme. And then this last year, they mixed in a little bit more drop or they played a lot more drop because of Rudy Gobert. But I actually thought Towns was competitive defensively. I thought he did well defensively this year. You don't want him on an island. He's not super switchable, and he's not a shot blocker, right? But like, I thought he was good as a 4, and it's only really a concern if he's anchoring your defense as a 5, and it depends on the scheme you're playing, or if you're asking him to be switchable beyond the perimeter, guard wings. Like, that's not going to go super well either.
Yeah, one thing that I zeroed in on when you were saying all that, unfortunately, I got some bad news. Tibbs more or less exclusively runs drop now to a fault. That's his new pet defensive scheme. He's not all about attacking the point of attack anymore. He pretty much always has Mitchell Robinson or Isaiah Hartenstein playing drop almost to a fault. Like, there's certain games where like a Kevin Love or a Torian Prince or guys like that will just go absolutely bonkers against the Knicks.
I guess that's true. Yeah.
But
well, and Towns has never, like, he did a little bit more of it this year, but usually he was on the floor and it was Gobert that was in those actions intentionally. And Towns was usually playing, they would have him as the low man, or they would, try and kind of, in a sense, hide him on a lower usage guy on the other team. Yeah. And he's still, like, he's not a horrible defender. It's just like, he's got to be in the right concept, and he's got to be like completely dialed in. And again, I think all that's improved. It's just like you said, it's still somewhat something of a concern.
Yeah. Well, I have some other concerns too. And a lot of it boils down to, how does this deal even work potentially? So let's get into that in the next segment, and we can talk turkey a little bit, talk about what we think these two teams could potentially do, or if we don't think there's a good fit to be made for Cat. And then maybe at the end, just throw some guys at the wall and see what sticks as far as potential other deals that these two teams might be interested in doing. So we'll take our last break and then we'll be right back in and do that. All right. So we're back in to finish up our discussion here. Now we're to the point where maybe some people skip to in the podcast or in the video already, where we talk about the potential offers that it could potentially get this deal done. Now let me outline some of my concerns as far as the deal is concerned. I've already said what my concerns are as far as Cat. So I think most of the players that the Knicks are being linked to now, and they seem to owe because he's a local kid. Like I said, I covered him in New Jersey. He grew up near New York. Like I believe he said multiple times he grew up a Knicks fan, like all sort of stuff. So that's a natural connection to make. But I think the difficulty here is that the Knicks seem to be looking for a wing upgrade. Most of the other guys that are being linked to now, and these are episodes we've done this week, like Paul George, Zach LaVine, guys of that ilk. They were like briefly, obviously this was different because this guy had everything in his own hands to decide where he wanted to go. But like there was talk of like, they would potentially be interested in Bradley Beal if he was interested in them, that sort of thing. So that seems to be the direction that the Knicks are looking right now. And the reason for that, or the reason I think that makes this trade difficult is because two things seem pretty guaranteed right now with the Knicks. And that is that maybe three. They're locked in on Jalen Brunson. Obviously, he's untouchable for all intents and purposes. They seem, at the very least, fairly locked in on Tibbs, and saying, you know what, he got them to the second round this year. Why would we change anything? I think that maybe if you hit next year and they underachieve some compared to what they did this year, then maybe we finally get into that discussion of like, okay, is Tibbs the right guy? Like, or do they need a coach to take them to a new level? Fine. But for now, I think they're committed to him, which obviously, like I said, maybe throws a wrench in the whole Cat thing. The third thing, though, is that I also think they're very committed to Julius Randle. There's very little scuttlebutt about them potentially moving Randle. And now, once upon a time, if this was like last off season, there would have been a part of me that would want to say like maybe because Julius was coming off a kind of troubled season. Cat, like you said, he's always sort of in trade rumors. And I think Gavin and I even talked about this. Maybe this was when we even talked last year, because I know that we talked once last year as well. But like, I think there was a world where maybe you could have seen like, oh, maybe a Julius Randle for Cat swap, just find them new scenery, bring Cat back to where he grew up, send Julius somewhere with a little less bright lights than New York, whatever. But now Julius seems to have figured it out, and the team seems extremely invested in him and not wanting to move him. So whoever comes in is going to presumably have to complement Randle and Brunson. The most obvious guy that seems like he would probably be the headliner of any big star trade is RJ Barrett, because he already is making the big boy money now. Like he's making his, 27 million or whatever it is, starting next year. And I think the team is way more, or I shouldn't say way more. They're definitely committed to RJ if they decide to go the route of just kind of running it back. But I feel like if you would, like say to Leon Rose, like, who are you the most committed to out of this young core? I'm pretty sure that he would put Emmanuel Quickley and Quentin Grimes as his top two guys and say, RJ, I understand, is probably the guy that we're going to have to trade to make something happen here. Which goes to what you alluded to too, that even at Cat's current lower cap number, he's still tough to match right now with like purely like young players and stuff. The Knicks do also, of course, have Obi Toppin that they seem fairly ready to move on from at this point, although who knows, they just signed his brother to a two-way deal, so I don't know what's going on there. But what are sort of your thoughts? Like if you were looking at a potential deal, you didn't seem too thrilled with the RJ concept earlier, but if that was the guy that was coming back, does that just make no sense for the T-Wolves because of Ant and because of how similar they are?
Yeah, that's where my head goes immediately. And I know that Barrett has played, he played more, I think a couple years ago, played more at the three. And so like you could play them together in theory.
That's like technically his role now for what it's worth too.
Gotcha.
Like Quinn Grimes is more like the nominal two, although they're very similar sized guys. Yeah. So they're just kind of just wings out there. But like Grimes, I think, is the nominal like two guard right now.
Okay. So, like, theoretically, they could play together. My concern is that offensively, they're similar enough, and they're both high usage guys. And, like, I mean, you're essentially recreating the problem you have with Cat and Rudy with then Barrett and Ant. And I know it's a little different with wings than bigs, at least defensively. In theory, it's easier to figure that out. And you can alternate, not literally alternate, but you can switch off who's initiating offense or whatever, who you're running plays for. But I'd have concerns about taking the ball to Ant's hands for, frankly, a less efficient player. And I know RJ Barrett can score, but he's not as efficient as Ant. And now clearly there's upside, and so, like, because he still is only 23, he just turned 23, I think. So there would be a ton of upside for that backcourt or for those wings to have both Ant and RJ Barrett. The concerns are around the inefficiency and, like, are you then taking possessions away from Ant in a similar way to, like, say, D'Angelo Russell did the first part of last year and the year prior? Was like, D'Lo was a relatively efficient scorer, but he didn't get to the line like Ant, and he didn't, he just, like, he used too many possessions with these mid-range jumpers, and you just want the ball in Ant's hands. And I worry a little bit about that with RJ Barrett. And so when I first looked at this and I looked at the Knicks roster, I was like, I don't know that you could even come up with a trade without him. And it's really hard to do. If the Wolves said, hey, we're not interested in RJ Barrett, like, I mean, you'd have to have, like, Evan Fournier's contract in there, almost for sure. And then from there, it's just throwing in a few smaller deals. Like, I think Hartenstein still has a year left on his deal. Is that right? So, like you could get there, but it'd be difficult to do it.
Yeah, like if the Knicks were going to throw together a deal, and mostly make it like pick forward
Yeah.
and less player forward, which they certainly could do. Like, with how the market's shaping up right now, if they threw like 4 picks the T-Wolves way, they would probably be like moderately okay with that, I would assume, because that would sort of recoup the Gobert trade and sort of like restock the cupboard a bit to make the team better going forward. They could, just from a pure salary perspective, make it work between, like, Evan Fournier, off the top of my head, Evan Fournier, Obi Toppin makes about $8 million, final year of his rookie deal. They smartly signed Daquan Jeffries and who's the other guy? Was it Roby? Isaiah Roby, to like 1-year deals at the end of the year that are on the cap sheet worth $2 million or something like that. So they could throw both those guys in there. That probably gets you close.
Yeah.
It's not, maybe not quite there yet, but within the 120% rule or 125% rule or whatever, that's probably like knocking on the door there. Maybe it would take like McBride or something, and they could make that work.
Yeah, and if I'm the Wolves, frankly, like, if it was me, or if like I'm saying what I think Tim Connolly would do, I want to say that he would be more likely to lean on the pick heavy return anyway, because of all the money they're already going to owe. And if you, like, I get that RJ Barrett makes a lot less than Towns still, or than Towns is going to, but if you're then backfilling that with a guy who's redundant with Edwards, at least a chunk of it, I just don't know that does a lot for the Wolves. So I think it would have to be, the Knicks have like 4 first-round picks next year. So I think, if you take a couple of firsts and a couple of seconds, and the Wolves certainly would ask for Emmanuel quickly, and it certainly sounds like the Knicks would not be interested in that at all. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, I think that would be a non-starter for them.
Yeah.
At this point, to be completely honest. Like, I think that because of Quickly's role on the team and how versatile he is, like, the great thing about Quickly versus, say, RJ, like, I actually just had a really good long discussion with my buddy Schwan about this on another Knicks pod Strickland today, actually, as we're recording this on Wednesday. And it was like, we were talking about it, and we're like, in a vacuum, I guess, like, RJ still is sort of like, by many ways to look at it, like the more talented player, like the guy that still at this point has more likelihood to turn into a potential like alpha scorer sort of thing, like number 1 option on a team sort of guy. But Quickly, I think if they're looking to add another high usage player, they're going to want to hold on to Quickly, because he's just proven to be so versatile, like, in the fact that he doesn't necessarily need the ball in his hands, but if you need him to have the ball in his hands, he can do that. If you need him to go out and get a bucket, he can find a way to do that. But he can also just spot up and hit 3-pointers. He can just go out there and really affect the game on defense, and then just be like a willing ball mover on offense. Like, he seems to have no qualms with doing whatever it takes when he's on the floor. I think he obviously prefers getting some initiation reps and stuff like that to be able to, be more of a point guard. But he just kind of does everything, and he plays really well with Jalen Brunson, plays really well with Julius Randle. Like, there's pretty much not a single guy on the team that you can look at and be like, he doesn't play well with that guy. He just has bonkers advanced numbers across the board like that. Are like, it was really funny. I saw this stat the other day. I brought this up on the Bulls pod the other day too, and they just raised their eyebrows. But so there was this like stat that this one website came out with that my friend sent me, that was like an asterisk stat to like put asterisks on championships based off like how many teams that team faced that year with guys that were injured and blah blah blah. And it was just kind of like a funny little experiment thing.
Yeah.
And yet when I was looking at it, I clicked on this season and it was like, oh, a top 30 player is worth more in terms of games missed than than like a top 150 player. And then like anything outside of a top 150 player didn't get an asterisk if that player missed time or whatever. And I looked at it nestled in between like Kawhi Leonard and Giannis and like everybody else was Emmanuel Quickly in the top 30, because they used like D Raptor or like Raptor War or something like that. And all these stats just like literally paint Emmanuel Quickly like he should be like if things keep progressing, like he'll be like all NBA or something.
Yeah.
So I think the Knicks are going to be very reluctant to include him.
And see, that's exactly when like, he's the guy that I would start if I'm Tim Connolly. I'd be like, well, I want Quickly and picks, and then we'll figure out the salaries. And I'm sure that it sounds like the Knicks would be like, no. And so then
you can have RJ. That's what they would say.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's like, well, we need more picks. And so that's why, like, I would never say that there's so many Knicks connections, and you touched on a couple, but like, I mean, Leon Rose is one, and obviously Tibbs is one, for better or for worse. And Towns, growing up in Jersey, growing up a Knicks fan, like, there's so many of those connections that it just kind of has felt like this is a persistent rumor. And even though Cat and the Wolves are saying all the right things, and I think it's tough to, like, if the Knicks don't trade Quickly, aren't going to include Quickly, and the Wolves don't want just a bunch of picks and a bunch of, salaries, it's hard to make it happen without RJ Barrett then. So, but like, we can never rule it out because of all those connections, and because, the Knicks are the Knicks, and they're going to be looking for another star. And I actually think, you talked about potentially the Towns Randall pairing. I wouldn't love that, but I also think Towns and Jalen Brunson would work well together. So, like, there's certainly, like, that's the thing about Towns' offensive game, is he can play whatever you want him. You can do whatever you want him to do on offense, and he's going to be dynamic. So, like, it's certainly the rumor is not going to go away. And it's certainly possible it could happen. To me, it's always felt like there should be a third team involved. If Quickly's not going to be traded, I think there almost has to be a third team.
Yeah, I kind of think so too. I think it would just take the Knicks sending RJ to some other team that would value him, and then that other team sending some players that are more akin to a Quickly type to the Timberwolves, because I think that it's very context dependent why the Knicks would want to hold on to Quickly versus hold on to Barrett, because they're just trying to, if you're shipping out RJ, you've opened up a giant chunk of usage that can be filled then. Whereas if you're shipping out Quickly, his usage isn't as high, and his need for usage isn't as high.
Yep.
And so therefore it's a lot easier to just like, it's a lot easier to move an RJ Barrett than it is to move it Quickly for the Knicks. Even if in a vacuum, RJ is still kind of more valuable, which is sort of like what you said, like from the Timberwolves perspective, they would just want to get more complementary players and turn things more over to Anthony Edwards to just sort of be like the alpha and omega of that team.
Exactly. And that's, sorry. And that's why, like, I'm sure there's another team out there that looks at RJ Barrett and says, hey, high usage scorer, like, if he turns the corner, he could be an all-star, and like, we'll take that chance because we're, insert random borderline playoff team here. And the Timberwolves would, all the reasons you've listed for why the Knicks wouldn't want to trade Quickly is why the Wolves would want Quickly, because they could plug him in. I said on the show several weeks ago on Locked On Wolves, like, hey, Mike Conley's under contract for one more year. Quickly could be the sixth man, play some combo guard off the bench. And then Conley leaves, it quickly could become your starting point guard next to Anthony Edwards, or however you want to term that. Like, that would be a perfect scenario where Quickly could score with the second unit. He could facilitate with the first unit, play off the ball with Ant. Like, there's so many, as a complementary player, a really, really good one. That type of player is exactly what the Wolves are looking for this offseason. And there's, versions that aren't nearly as good as quickly that the Wolves have been connected to in free agency and on the trade market, of guys that could run the second unit and also play with Ant and quickly would absolutely fit that bill. So yeah, I mean, I think a third team, and the Knicks having a ton of picks are another reason why they're going to be in the conversation if the Wolves trade Towns, because the Wolves don't have a lot of picks on their ledger because of the Gobert trade. So it's certainly something that's not going to go away.
Yeah, and I think, I wanted to talk about some more players and whatever, but we're running a little short on time. And also, I mean, I feel like we covered almost all of them.
Yeah.
All the relevant ones at least. I would have in a different world, I would have potentially brought up Taurean Prince as a possible guy that the Knicks would maybe want just for some bench shooting, or a Naz Reid in a potential like sign and trade, but obviously both those options are off the table now.
Yep.
For all intents and purposes. So I think we've pretty much reached the end here. It's an intriguing pairing, these two teams. I think they're going to be linked to one another for a little bit, until things are eventually resolved with Towns one way or another, whether they decide to keep him or they decide to trade him to the Knicks or elsewhere. But I think this was a cool discussion. And you know what? Honestly, for all the semi smack I talked on Towns during this podcast, like I agree with you in the sense that he is a generational big man scorer, and those don't grow on trees, and generational scorers, period, don't grow on trees. And like, if the Knicks felt that they could harness him in a proper way and still build a good enough defense around him and mend fences between him and Tibbs and all that stuff, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if they could come out with a decent deal for him. Perhaps a 3-teamer, like you said, where you can effectively swap RJ Barrett and a few picks for Towns. Could solve a lot of the Knicks' offensive problems. Let's put it that way. Although hopefully wouldn't tank their defense too much. But at any rate, Ben, I think this is a good point to wrap up on, at risk of going too long. So this was great. This is a great crossover. I'm sure, if this does drag on to the season and potentially towards the trade deadline, I'm sure we'll be talking about this again, and potentially making some more fake trades and stuff. But this was great, man. Thanks for like coming and hanging out and talking some Knicks and Timberwolves stuff.
Likewise. I appreciate it, Alex. It was fun.
All right. Well, that's it for this crossover edition of Locked On Knicks and Locked On Wolves. For anyone on one side or the other that's curious about the other team, be sure to check out the opposing feeds and you can see what we're talking about and what's going on with the teams. But free agency starts tomorrow. So there's surely going to be a lot to talk about as far as free agency and trades and stuff from both of our perspectives here. Already some moves going down in Timberwolves land. So, there's some stuff to check out there already. But till next time, thank you guys all for listening. And this is cool. Peace out, everybody.
All right, that'll do it for the Locked On Knicks, Locked On Wolves crossover. As you heard, I don't know that there's a 2-team trade to be done. There may need to be a third team involved. If the Wolves can't get Emmanuel quickly, I just don't know that this is worth the conversation. Now, all the picks are interesting. Of course, the Knicks' interest in Towns has been well documented. So if there could be a third team involved, and if Cat is going to be traded, which again is still a pretty big if, we've gotten we're kind of all over the map on how likely a Cat trade is still, right? So all that to say, fun conversation, good talking to Alex. On Friday's show, for everydayers, I mean, of course, we Monday through Friday every day. I'm going to do a little bit more of kind of I haven't gotten the chance this week. There's been so much going on, but want to get back to talking a little draft. Of course, free agency is Friday, so we'll also talk about like, hey, what happens today? What happens tomorrow, Friday? And there's some Locked On free agency show stuff happening during the day Friday. So if anything big breaks, I'll be out there. We'll do do some sort of a live hit. So I'll tweet all that out if it happens. But anyway, Friday show, we'll definitely talk a little free agency. We'll talk a little draft recap. And then next week we get into summer league. So a bunch of shows, packed shows coming up here. And again, we're still daily, Monday through Friday throughout the month of July. So make sure you tune back in next week as well. A big thank you for watching and listening. Once again, of course, you can listen wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can also watch on YouTube and the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. The Locked On Network is your local experts on the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.